The way ideas take hold in culture is reminiscent of a lava flow. Mostly it rests in a steady state, mixing and moving slowly, but occasionally the pressure builds and it erupts violently. When newly emerged, it's burning hot, destructive of what lays in its path and what was there before. As it cools, it solidifies and is the fertile ground for growth. The period around the turn of the 20th century witnessed one of these eruptions. This period came to be known as modernism. Artists, musicians, scientists, writers were all looking for new ideas to fit the changing times. But soon the red-hot flow of the new ideas of modernism began to cool. The destruction of old ideas had been so swift and exciting that people were blinded to the unintended effects. Modernism had proved to be Western-centric and was used as an excuse for abuse under the term progress. Artists and other thinkers began to reevaluate the changes that modernism brought. Around the mid-20th century, a new period, known as postmodernism, emerged. It was a new way of looking at how the world had evolved. It affected many aspects of life, art, literature, economics, and science. These theoretical ideas about postmodern culture began in the social sciences and the humanities, especially literary criticism. To continue our metaphor of the lava flow, they bubbled organically to the surface in many disciplines. But since we are here to talk about art, we'll focus on how art began to change. One of the biggest effects of postmodernism was that the traditional arts of painting and sculpture no longer served the expressive needs of some artists. Postmodernism emphasized the idea of systems, and many artists began to look for ways to connect their work to culture more directly. We're going to look at some artists, again loosely grouped according to broad categories, who have used new tools and new media to express their new ideas about art and culture. The art movement known as Dada saw artists begin to use their own bodies in their work and the blurring of lines between media. Sophie Taeuber-Arp was both an artist and a dancer, Hugo Ball a poet. Although he came after Dada had faded, Yves Klein was an important bridge artist between the Dada artists and the later artists who used bodies in their work. When Klein was 19, he and some other artist friends decided to divide the world up between them. Klein chose the ether surrounding the planet and proceeded to sign it, claiming it as his own. For Klein, this action made the whole universe fair game for artistic expression. In later work, Klein produced many paintings and other objects in what he called International Klein Blue. His exhibitions consisted of monochrome canvases painted in IKB. Later, he used human models as paintbrushes to create some of these paintings. The Dada artists and their anti-art approach were aesthetic ancestors of a group of artists who in the late 50s and early 60s participated in art festivals organized by George Maciunas, known as Fluxus, from the Latin word flux, meaning fluid or flowing. Their work was anti-commercial and often consisted of temporary performances or street theater. These artists were instrumental in expanding the definition of what could be considered art. In a famous piece from that time, Yoko Ono invited audience members on stage to cut off pieces of her clothing while she sat passively on stage. This put the audience members in control of the work, reversing the usual roles of artist as doer and viewer as passive.
That is where I sleep, underneath the arches. I dream my dreams away, underneath the arches.
Gilbert Prouch and George Passmore met in art school and began making work together under the name Gilbert and George. They felt that since nothing is as complex as the human body, no sculpture could be as complex as when using themselves in their work. In the singing sculpture, they painted their faces gold and stood on a table in an art gallery singing the same British ditty over and over for up to 8 hours a day. Later they used large-scale, brightly colored photographs as the main medium of their work, always appearing somewhere in the picture. In her Silhouette series from the 1970s, Ana Mendieta makes what she calls earth body sculptures, exploring the spiritual relationship with nature. One of the earliest feminist artists, she also addressed notions of beauty, identity, and violence against women. She was married to a well-known minimalist sculptor, Carl Andre. Ironically, In 1985, she fell to her death from the window of their 34th floor apartment building. Andre was tried and acquitted of her murder. Whether her death was an accident, suicide, or murder remains a mystery. Expanding language to include the body was a focus of Ketty LaRocca's work. Originally a poet, her work crossed boundaries of the written, spoken, and visual realms. She made a series exploring the expressiveness of hands, specifically women's hands, where the body, gestures, and written language were interconnected. Vito Acconci also began as a poet. His work was often confrontational and political in nature. In one work, he chose someone from the street at random and followed them until they entered a building. In another work, he rubbed a place on his arm until he began to bleed. Acconci wanted to create situations where the viewer became a participant, but often not willingly. Art critic Rosalind Krauss says that Acconci's work operates on the boundaries between narcissism and self-critique. How does one live in the face of the uselessness of one's actions? This is the question the work of He Young Chang asks. His performances place his body under extreme conditions for extended periods. In an early work, he hung upside down from a crane trying to cut a stream in half with a knife. In another work, he was sealed in a concrete pillar for 24 hours. In a piece titled A Meter of Democracy, he invited 24 friends to vote on whether he should have a doctor cut a 1.5 centimeter by 1 meter slice in his body. Placed in a situation where they had to decide between He's pain and his artistic statement, the participants had to wrestle with a variety of emotions. Because he had the final say, the vote was a false one, just like many democratic elections around the world, and he went forward with the plan. In a month-long work between winter and spring, he lay in his front yard and waited for the grass to appear. These extreme actions are meant to show that even though we have little control over our lives, through our will we can make our lives meaningful. Once again, the modernists were trailblazers. Challenging the disconnect between the high art of the academic tradition, some began assembling the everyday stuff of life to make art. These artists expanded the vocabulary of what was acceptable material for making art. Jean Tinguely made sculptures that mocked capitalism's obsession with the production of material goods. His sculptures, known as metamechanics or kinetic art, perform useless movements or blew themselves up after a flurry of pointless actions. Using the refuse of the day, Tinguely's work was some of the first sculpture to include movement. As part of the U.S.'s controversial relationship between the legacy of slavery and the civil rights era, the African American community grappled with how they might gain access to the economic prospects that white Americans had. Unfortunately, Black Americans often had to deny their own culture and values in an attempt to assimilate into the mainstream. As Black Americans struggled to obtain equal rights and opportunities, magazines like Ebony and Jet addressed issues that dealt with supporting the Black community. Ellen Gallagher appropriates and manipulates images from these magazines, and her work makes a strong statement about racism, self-esteem, and identity in the U.S.
It's something that emotes, and it's motorized, and it is an emoter. I can't make most of these faces myself. It's using my face because it's readily available. I have exclusive rights to my face.
Tim Hawkinson has a quirky vision of the everyday. He finds the extraordinary in the mundane. His work reflects what it is like to be curious about everything. He has made giant musical installations, uses video and light sensors to distort his own face, and combines ordinary materials to make sculptures that are both poetic and humorous. Daniel Spoeri is another artist who uses found objects. In the early 60s, Sperry made his first of what he called snare pictures. Sperry explained the snare pictures as objects found in chance positions, in order or disorder, on tables, in boxes, drawers, etc., are fixed, snared as they are, only the plane is changed. In one snare picture from 1964, Sperry captured the remains of a meal eaten by Marcel Duchamp. The position of women in a male-dominated society is the subject of much of the work of Linda Benglis. Even though abstract, the organic nature of her work took on the male-dominated minimalist work of the 1970s. Her floor pieces represented the position of the fallen woman as a victim of male desire. In a 1974 Art Forum article, critic Robert Pincus Witten wrote of Benglis' work. With the endless environment as the ground for the frozen gesture, she embraced the notion of theatricality and all that it implies: temporality, performance, personality, media, exploitation. Yinka Shonibari was born in London but moved to Lagos, Nigeria when he was 3. Returning to London to art school, he was diagnosed with transverse myelitis, which is inflammation of the spinal cord, and was left in complete paralysis. He was part of a graduating class of artists known as the Young British Artists, many of whom have gone on to become major names in the world art scene. Shonibari refused to be defined by his disability. His work addresses issues of African colonialism and the economic and political history of Africa and Europe. The meaning of cultural and national boundaries in a global world is called into question through his work. Do Ho Suh's father was a well-known artist in Korea. Do Ho thought he needed to leave Korea to escape his father's shadow and migrated to the U.S. for art school. He now spends time in both countries, and his relationship to both countries fuels his work. His work often uses multiples to fill entire spaces with sculptures that deal with identity, individuality, and collectivity. Juanita Quick-to-See Smith is one of the few Native Americans to break into the mainstream art world. Her multimedia works, like Ellen Gallagher's, also explore race and the history of Native Americans, now outsiders in their own land. As artists continued to expand their vocabulary of acceptable avenues for art making, some also naturally gravitated towards expanding the field where their art was made. In 1923, artist Kurt Schwitters began work on his Meersbau, literally a work of art to live in. Artists who manipulate place came to be known in the 1970s as installation artists. The Los Angeles art scene owes a lot to Ed Kienholz. Along with Bob Alexander, he opened the seminal Ferris Gallery in 1957. In 1958, he sold his share of the gallery to focus on his art. Although he had no artistic training, he did have training as a mechanic and a carpenter. He began to show his large installations at the Ferris Gallery in '58. In 1966, his installation Backseat Dodge was called revolting, pornographic, and blasphemous by the LA County Board of Supervisors, and they threatened to withhold funding from the LA County Museum of Art where the installation was being shown unless it was removed. After 1972, he began collaborating with his wife, Nancy Redden. Their work continued to address themes of racism, sexual stereotypes, politics, and hypocrisy. Known as the father of video art, Nam June Paik began his artistic career as a member of the Fluxus Artists. His early performances from the 1960s often were related to musical instruments that he invented, which included television screens in some way. When portable video recorders became available to the general public, Paik was one of the first artists to exploit this technology. He continued to use electronic telecommunication devices in his installations, often altering the images using videotape or magnets. He envisioned an electronic superhighway that in some ways foreshadowed what today has become social media. Song Dong's work deals with impermanence and change. His early performance works consisted of actions that created temporary results that the elements would destroy. For example, he kept a diary by writing with water on a stone. In his work Breathing, he lay face down on Tiananmen Square in the freezing cold until his breath formed a small temporary sheet of ice. Song's relationship with his early life also led him to create large-scale installations of things that his mother and other members of his village used over the years. In Waste Not, Over 10,000 items that his mother had frugally hoarded make up the installation. Eleanor Antine began doing installations using mundane objects in the early 70s. In 100 Boots, Antine photographed boots in various scenes around Southern California and had the photos made into postcards which she then mailed to people in institutions, bypassing the traditional exhibition in the gallery system. Antine's interest in identity, namely gender, race, and culture, led to a series of photographic works and elaborately staged videos. Often her alter ego is the protagonist in these works.
Fire!
The Chinese have a long tradition with fireworks. Artist Kai Guo Chang utilizes this tradition to create ephemeral artworks that incorporate light and sound. He uses gunpowder to draw on paper or in the sky. His more recent works are large-scale installations commenting on a globalized China. Anne Hamilton combines all sorts of non-traditional media in installations that deal with time, community, language, and memory. Sometimes her works are quite large, other times small and intimate. Her installations are often site-specific and build on the history of the place. In the 1999 Venice Biennale, part of her exhibition included an installation that was concerned with things not easily seen or heard. Fuchsia-colored powder fell from the joint between the wall and ceiling of a room. The powder caught on small plaster projections. These projections spelled out in Braille the text that had to do with court cases involving property disputes and acts of violence. Because of the element of time and the delicacy of the powder, it was impossible to ever fully read the text. His early life growing up in Puerto Rico and his time spent as a social worker in the Bronx helped to form Pepo Nasario's feeling that artists should return art to the community. He is interested in how art can affect social change. His installations are often done in storefronts, department stores, and people's homes. They evolve from an interaction with the people from the neighborhood and are usually comprised of a dense collection of elements that reflect Latino culture. The modernists were outrageous rebels of their time. They set the stage for the idea that art could be part of the political, scientific, and cultural revolutions that were part of their lives. But modernism's implication that progress was linear took art in a direction that became overly theoretical and exclusive for the artists of a more global age. The emphasis on formalism and abstraction that was the outcome of the early modernist ethos was eventually transcended by an aesthetic that valued process over product, connection rather than originality, inclusion rather than exclusion. New communication tools lent themselves to new forms of expression. Artists in this era of postmodernism continue to push cultural boundaries, but their work is grounded in the culture rather than adjunct to it. However, due to its emphasis on relativity, postmodernism has its critics. Reactionary thinkers feel that postmodernism's emphasis is on viewing culture from an overly complicated point of view. Postmodernism challenges the idea of meritocracy. It creates an unstable foundation for making value judgments. Certainly, the very nature of what art is and is for has changed. How do we decide what art is useful, interesting, or valuable if anything and everything could be used for making it? For now, the lava continues to bubble.